Hey guys, so this is lesson 8, how to make a bar and a line graph. So I'm going to go backwards for a second and look at the last thing I talked about in lesson 7. Okay, so in lesson 7, the very last thing that I said, we're going to look here on the right, I just wanted to make it smaller, was that there were 7 parts to a graph, 6 that you need to make sure that you have correct, and then a 7th one that you might need to have and you might not. So let's go back through really quick. Every graph needs to have a title. Every graph needs to have labels for your different categories of what's being analyzed on the x-axis. And then you need a label for the entire x-axis. You need to have a scale with an appropriate interval. You need to have a label for that y-axis telling me what those numbers stand for. And you need to have properly placed data. Those are the 6 things that every graph needs to have. Now, the 7th thing that you might have, but you might not, is that break. And remember, we only use a break if there's a big jump in information between 0 and whatever your lowest piece of data is. Okay, so today I'm just gonna show you making some graphs. Okay, in class you guys will be getting graph paper and rulers, and we'd be having a good old time with this. But because we're not in class, I'm just gonna kind of model this. I'll do some on my office hours too, so you guys can help me out and everything with that. Okay, so our very first example here is about campers who have passed a swimming test, okay? And we have 4 weeks of information. So we have to go through some questions here in order to figure things out. So the first thing I forgot to include what the first thing we have to figure out is what type of graph. So we have to go back to thinking about lesson 6 in order to figure out what type of graph. So our choices are going to be between a bar graph and a line graph, because we're not going to be making pictographs or circle graphs or anything here in 5th grade. We just focus on line graphs and bar graphs. So looking at this information, we have week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. There's our big hint for what type of graph this is. So our bar graph is used to compare data, and our line graph is used to show change over time. So because we're talking about the number of kids each week, that's going to be change over time. So in order to graph this, the first thing you have to do is figure out what your title is going to be. So when you look at this, the title is basically right here with your information. So the title of this graph would be campers, and I'm going to kind of who passed the swimming test. Sorry, that's a little, sorry, that's a little tiny there. Sorry, I don't have a lot of space in there. Okay, so that's our title coming right from our information. To make this line graph, would you put the weeks along the y-axis or the x-axis? So would you be writing week 1, week 2, week 3 along the x or the y? Hopefully you remember from yesterday's lesson that type of information goes along our x. So down here at the bottom, and this is pretty small, so week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4, and then my label would be weeks. Okay, and then along our y-axis, if we know that there's 100 campers at the camp, what scale would we use? Well, we know our scale has to start at 0, and if there's a possibility of 100 people, we would have to go from 0 to 100. Now we have to think about what would our interval be if I'm going from 0 to 100. So I'm thinking that I would probably do every 5 or every 10. So I could have an interval of 5 or 10. So I don't have to put the 5 or the 10 on the very next line. I can skip a line. So I'm going to go 10. And this is going to be super tiny, guys. Sorry. 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. And I would keep going until I got to 100. Okay. I don't really need a break here. I mean, I could use one from 0 to 50, but it's okay. I'm going to have all my data kind of plotted up in this area, and that's okay because I can fit from 0 to 100 on this scale and make it look okay. A break would have been okay too. I could have done a break from 0 to 50 as well. That's a choice that you kind of have to make on your own. Okay, so we know our label for our x-axis would be weeks. What would our label for our y-axis be? What do those numbers stand for? So kind of think about that. So I hope in your head you're thinking, those numbers stand for the amount of campers who passed the swimming test. So I put number of campers who passed. Okay, and that would be my label for my y-axis there. Okay, so let's look at another example of a graph. Okay, so on the left here, I have some information about Pedro's Pizza sales. Okay, and so here I have the information for January, February, March, April, May, June, July, and August. And down here I have all the things that I'm going to need to make sure that I get into my graph. Now I did some of this ahead of time, so it can kind of move on a little quicker here, guys. But looking over here, number one, title. The title is Pedro's Pizza Sales. So I'm looking over here at my information. There's my title right at the top. So I literally can just put that right at the top. If you have a good data table, all the information you need for labels will be right on that data table. Okay, so Pedro's Pizza Sales is our title. So check. Okay, I need an x-axis category label. So down here on the x-axis, what information am I going to be putting down here? Well, looking at this, I have January, February, March, or I have the amount of pizzas. So just thinking back, our x-axis is always going to be the things, the items that are being analyzed or that are in categories, okay? So I have categories of months here. So for my category labels, let me scroll down here for a second. This is number 2. And so I have my months put along there. Now I want you to notice something important. This is super important, and this changes between our different types of graphs. Notice I have January label right there underneath that line, and the February label is right underneath the line, so is the March label. Okay, and I'll talk about why here in a second. Okay, so we have our category labels. We need an x-axis label. Well, January, February, March, April, sorry, May, June, and July, they are all months. So my label for the x-axis would be, months. Okay, so we have our x-axis label. We need a scale with an appropriate interval. So looking over here, we know it's going to start at 0. It has to go to the highest number. So looking at our amounts of pizzas, the highest number is 130. So it has to go from 0 to 130. So I have to figure out what's my interval. And at the same time, I kind of do 4 and 5 together. At the same time, do I want a break? So let's look and see what Mrs. Lehman decided. Oh, I did 0, and then I went to 90, 95, and the whole way up to 135. So because I went from 0 to 90, yes, I am putting a break in there, okay? Because there's no data between 0 and 90. And then I went the whole way up with an interval of 5, the whole way up to 135. Now you'll notice I skipped 2 spaces in between each of our numbers, and that's okay as long as I did the same amount of skipping going the whole way. And that's just to stretch out the information to make a prettier picture. Okay, so we have our interval, our scale with our interval, we have a break, and then number 6. What do those numbers stand for? What would my label be? So it's 120 what? It's the number of pizzas that were sold. Okay, so we have our label right there. And now the last thing we have to do, sorry, my things keep disappearing on me. Boom, 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 boom. So then the last thing I have to do is plot my data. So here's the thing. I am showing January, February, March, April. Am I making a line graph or am I making a bar graph? Well, because this is going in months, that is change over time. So that's going to be a line graph. So coming back to where I circled down here, January, February, March, noticing that they're right on the line. When you're making a line graph, you want your category labels to be right on the line so you can come straight up that line in order to plot your points. So in January, it was 90 pizzas. February was 95. March was 110. April is 100. May was 115. June is 125. July is 120. July 120. And then August is 130, going right there. Okay, and because this is a line graph, I have to go January to February, February to March, March to April, April to May, June, July, August. So we see sales increasing, then decreasing, and then increasing, decrease, and increase. So we can see the change happening over time. Okay, so once again, looking at this x-axis categories, because we were plotting points, we wanted our category label to be on the line. It's going to look a little different with the next one, okay? Okay, so in class, this would have been a pattern block grab. So I would have given you a bag and you would have grabbed pattern blocks out of it in order to kind of have a little fun with this. But since we're not in class and I can't give you pattern blocks, I just decided how many we would have grabbed. So in our data table, we got 3 triangles, 4 squares, 2 rhombus, 5 kites, 2 trapezoids, and 1 hexagon. So we need to have all those same parts, okay? So my title already came in. This was pattern block grab, so boom, title done. So my x-axis categories. Now you're gonna notice something different here. Let's see what happens. Okay, so I have triangles, squares, rhombus, kites, trapezoids, and hexagons. Now notice those words are not right below a line this time. They're right below a space. Okay, let's think about why that might be. Okay, and I'll come back to it here in a second. So we have our category labels. We need our x-axis label. Well, all of those things are shapes. So that's our category, our x-axis label for the categories. We need a scale with an appropriate interval. So it has to start at 0. Looking at our data, our highest number is 5. So it only has to go from 0 to 5. So do we need a break? Absolutely not, because we're just going from 0 to 5. So looking at our scale, we go from 0 to 5, just going straight up, no break necessary. And then what do those numbers mean? That's our y-axis label. They mean the number of shapes that were grabbed out of the bag. Okay? So now let's look at placing our data. Okay? So because I'm comparing how many shapes, different shapes were grabbed out of the bag, and I'm doing a comparison here, this is going to be a bar graph. And because I'm going to be creating bars of information, that's why these labels are in the space. So I can take a bar straight up in those spaces. So when you make a line graph, you want your category labels on a line so you can bring your pencil right up that line to create a point. But when you're making bars, you want it in the spaces so you can take the bar right up from it. Okay, so for triangles, I had 3 triangles grabbed. So I'm going to color in a bar showing 3 triangles. And yeah, I know my stuff disappeared. I'll pull it back up here in a second. It's very sensitive. Okay, and then different color, because we want to make our information pop here. Squares, there were 4, so we have 4 squares. Color in our bar. And then there were 2 rhombus, going up here to 2, color in that bar. Oh, right there, okay. Kites, there was 5. Yep, 5 kites, so going the whole way up to 5. And coloring that in. And then our trapezoids, we had 2. So I already used purple. Let's do yellow. So 2 trapezoids. And then for our hexagons, we have 1. I guess I'll use black. That's my only color left. So 1. Whoops, I went a little, oops, hold on. Can't have that. Went a little over the line there. Okay. So having 1 hexagon right there. Okay, and I know I didn't color in all the spaces, just my stylus isn't quite getting it all. But when you look at that information starts to pop a little bit, especially if you clean it up a little, and you can compare and you can say, oh, kites had the most, hexagon had the fewest, we had a tie with rhombus and trapezoids. Okay, so that just starts to clear up there when you show the comparing information. Okay, guys, so that's it for today as far as how to make bar graphs and line graphs. I'm still trying to find a program that maybe you guys can make some. I know I'm going to give you an IXL thing that'll help you make some of them, but it's not quite going from scratch. So have a great day, and I will talk to you later.